Red Bull arrived in China expecting damage control. What they got was a warning. Because with only a few laps left in the Chinese Grand Prix, Max Verstappen was fighting just to save 6th place, when suddenly the RB22 lost power. The steering wheel went dark. The car slowed. And the reigning world champion was forced to retire. A DNF. In the second race of the season. But that's not the real shock. Inside the paddock, engineers immediately started whispering about something far more serious. An electrical failure. Inside the brand new Ford hybrid system. And if that suspicion is true, it means the problem isn't just one race. It could threaten the entire Red Bull project. Because this was supposed to be the engine that defines the next era of Formula One. Instead, it failed in Shanghai. And the timing could not be worse. Verstappen had already called the RB22 almost impossible to drive during the weekend, and in the race, the car collapsed completely. Meanwhile, Mercedes dominated the Grand Prix. Ferrari stayed competitive. And Red Bull, the team that ruled the sport not long ago, suddenly looks vulnerable. So the real question is not why Verstappen retired. The real question is this. Did China just expose a small reliability issue? Or the first crack in Red Bull's new engine era? Subscribe now. Because what really happened inside the RB22 during those final laps changes the entire story. Everyone inside the Shanghai paddock could feel it from the very beginning. Something about Red Bull this weekend felt wrong. Not slow in the obvious way. Not broken. Just uncomfortable. The RB22 looked nervous on track. Unstable under braking. And strangely inconsistent when exiting slow corners. That alone raised eyebrows. Because this is the team that spent years building the most dominant car of the modern era. A car that could win almost anywhere. In any conditions. Against any strategy. But in China, that confidence simply was not there. And the first real warning came during qualifying. Max Verstappen pushed as hard as he could. 1 lap. Everything on the line. But when the timing screens updated, the result shocked the paddock. 8th place. Almost a full second away from pole. For a driver who built his reputation on crushing qualifying sessions, this result felt almost unreal. And yet, that wasn't the most surprising detail. Because directly behind him on the grid was Isaac Hadjar. The rookie. Separated by barely a tenth of a second. That moment changed the conversation immediately. Because when a rookie driver reaches almost the same pace as a 4-time world champion, engineers start asking uncomfortable questions. Is the driver struggling? Or is the car already at its limit? Inside the Red Bull garage, the answer seemed clear. The RB22 simply did not respond to setup changes. Engineers tried adjustments. Ride height changes. Differential settings. Energy deployment tweaks. But Verstappen kept repeating the same message over the radio and in interviews. The car felt extremely difficult to drive. Almost unpredictable. At one point during the weekend he described every lap as survival. And that phrase spread quickly across the paddock. Survival. For a Red Bull driver. That alone tells you how unusual this weekend was. But here is where the story becomes more interesting. Because qualifying pace is only one piece of the puzzle. What worried engineers even more was what they were seeing in the telemetry. On the long straight of Shanghai, the RB22 sometimes looked competitive. But in other laps, the energy deployment simply faded earlier than expected. The electrical boost disappeared too soon, which forced the car to rely only on the combustion engine during the final part of the straight. That might sound like a small detail. But in modern Formula One, that difference can cost several tenths every lap. And when you multiply that across an entire race distance, the gap becomes enormous. But most fans watching the weekend did not notice that detail. They only saw the headline. Verstappen starting 8th. Hadjar close behind. And Red Bull suddenly fighting in the middle of the grid. What many people missed was the tension inside the team. Because the RB22 is not just another car. It represents a massive technical shift. A new philosophy. A new integration between chassis, aerodynamics, and the hybrid power unit. And when those systems fail to align perfectly, the car becomes extremely sensitive. Very fast in theory. But frustrating in reality. That is exactly the type of machine drivers describe as having a narrow operating window. And according to several engineers in the paddock, that might be the real issue Red Bull is facing right now. The RB22 only works perfectly under very specific conditions. Temperature, ride height, energy deployment, tire behavior. Move slightly outside that window, and the balance collapses. Which explains why Verstappen looked so uncomfortable throughout the weekend. But even that was not the biggest concern. Because hidden behind the balance problems, there was another issue developing quietly. An issue connected to the one system every modern Formula One car depends on. the hybrid power unit. And by Sunday afternoon, that hidden weakness was about to reveal itself in the worst possible way. The race itself started exactly the way Red Bull feared. Chaos. Shanghai's opening sequence is brutal if you start outside the front rows, and Verstappen immediately found himself trapped in the worst possible situation. Dirty air, cars on every side, and a Red Bull that still did not feel stable under heavy braking. When the lights went out, the launch looked average at best. Within seconds, faster reactions from cars around him pushed Verstappen backwards. Not forward. Backwards. By the time the field squeezed through the first corners, the world champion had dropped deep into the midfield pack. 12th. Then briefly even further. For a driver used to controlling races from the front, this was unfamiliar territory. And the danger of running in the midfield is something Formula One drivers talk about constantly. Because when you are surrounded by slower cars, the race becomes unpredictable. Turbulent air destroys aerodynamic grip. Braking zones become chaotic. And every overtake carries risk. But Verstappen did what only elite drivers manage to do consistently. He adapted. Instead of pushing aggressively and risking contact, he began climbing back through the field with calculated moves. Clean overtakes. Measured braking. Perfect traction on corner exits. Lap after lap, the Red Bull slowly worked its way forward. 12th became 10th. 10th became 8th. And eventually Verstappen reached 6th place. Not spectacular. But under the circumstances, it was a strong recovery drive. For Red Bull, this was exactly the scenario they needed. Damage limitation. Collect solid points. Leave China with something. But there was one problem. And almost nobody watching the race noticed it at first. Because while Verstappen was climbing through the field, the engineers were already seeing something strange in the data. Energy deployment was inconsistent. Sometimes the car accelerated normally down the long Shanghai Straight. Other times the electrical boost disappeared earlier than expected. The difference was subtle. But in Formula One, subtle differences often reveal major problems. The telemetry suggested that the hybrid system was struggling to maintain stable power delivery. Not failing completely, just fluctuating. At this stage, the team could still manage it. Engineers adjusted energy maps remotely. Verstappen modified his driving slightly. Everything looked under control. But here is the detail that makes this moment so important. Hybrid issues almost never stay small. When a system begins showing instability, the stress inside the electrical components usually increases with every lap. Temperatures rise. Battery loads spike. Electronic protections start activating. And eventually, the system reaches a point where it can no longer stabilize itself. That moment arrived late in the race. Very late. With roughly 10 laps remaining. Verstappen was still holding 6th position. Still pushing. Still trying to secure valuable points for the championship. Then suddenly, something changed. Not dramatically. Not immediately obvious. Just a slight hesitation when exiting one of Shanghai's medium-speed corners. The kind of hesitation that only a Formula One driver can truly feel. Less acceleration. Less response. A small but worrying delay in power delivery. Verstappen instantly recognized the symptom. And within seconds, he spoke on the radio. Calm, but concerned. Because what he was feeling suggested something far more serious was about to happen. And unfortunately for Red Bull, he was right. For a few seconds, nothing looked dramatic. No smoke. No explosion. No sudden stop on track. Just a Red Bull that suddenly felt slower. Verstappen exited the corner and pressed the throttle. Normally, the RB22 would surge forward with the full force of the hybrid system. Combustion engine. Electric boost. Perfectly synchronized. But this time the acceleration felt incomplete. Like part of the power had simply disappeared. At first, Max thought it might be energy management. Sometimes the battery temporarily runs low, especially late in a race. But the next corner confirmed something was wrong. The power delivery was inconsistent. On one straight the car pulled normally. On the next, it didn't. And then something happened that instantly alarmed the entire team. For a brief moment, the steering wheel display went dark. Just 1 second. But that second revealed everything. Because the steering wheel display is connected directly to the car's electronic control systems. If the screen shuts off, even briefly, it means the electrical network inside the car has suffered an interruption. And in a hybrid Formula One machine, that is a critical warning. Verstappen immediately reported it. Power loss. Electrical issue. The engineers on the pit wall started scanning the telemetry. Thousands of data channels updating every millisecond. Battery voltage. MGUK deployment. Energy recovery. Control electronics. Within seconds, they realized the situation was deteriorating. The hybrid system was no longer delivering stable power. Sometimes the electric motor assisted normally. Other times it stopped deploying completely. That might sound like a small performance loss. But in modern Formula 1, hybrid power can represent more than 150 horsepower. Lose that suddenly, and the car becomes dramatically slower. And that is exactly what Verstappen began experiencing. On the long Shanghai straight, cars behind started closing rapidly. The Red Bull that once dominated top speed charts now looked vulnerable. Max had to lift earlier, brake sooner, and manage the remaining systems carefully just to keep the car running. But here is the problem with electrical failures in Formula 1. They rarely stabilize. They usually escalate. And the engineers could see it happening in real time. Voltage drops, deployment interruptions, electronic protection systems activating to prevent permanent damage. Inside the Red Bull garage, mechanics were already preparing for the worst. Because if the system completely failed on track, the car could stop in a dangerous position. And with only a few laps remaining in the Chinese Grand Prix, the team faced a difficult decision. Keep Verstappen on track and risk a total shutdown. Or retire the car before the situation became critical. For a few tense moments, they tried to manage it. Verstappen adjusted his energy settings. Engineers altered deployment maps. But nothing restored the lost power. Every lap the symptoms became clearer. The hybrid system was collapsing. Finally the instruction came over the radio. Short. Direct. Box the car. Retire. Just like that, the reigning world champions race ended inside the pit lane. No crash. No dramatic incident. Just a quiet, technical failure that exposed something much more worrying. Because this was not just any engine problem. This involved the electrical side of the power unit. The most complex part of the modern Formula 1 machine. And the part most closely connected to Red Bull's new partnership with Ford. Which immediately triggered the question spreading through the paddock after the race. Was this just a random electrical glitch? Or the first real reliability warning for the entire Red Bull Ford power project?